Thank you for being with us this evening. To our climate crisis, racial injustice, decolonization, making the connections. 400 years plus of racial injustice for people and 200 years plus of escalating carbon for our planet have brought us to this day of reckoning, this day of climate crisis, this day of racial unrest, and the need for decolonization. Changes in the systems that have caused these problems because they are no longer acceptable. I'm going to share an image posted by Greta Thunberg. Each red dot symbolizes a location that has experienced the hottest temperature ever recorded this past August 2020. So when we speak of climate crisis, this image is an example. So we have climate crisis, racial unrest, and the need for decolonization. These are all connected. We are continuing on the path of peace, a path begun by others before us, a path of peace, healing, justice, and respect for all life. Some have been on this path from the beginning. Others have joined along the way, and many are entering now, bringing their enthusiasm for old and newly discovered truths. No matter where we are along this path, this evening's conversation can be one of many steps needed to help bring us through this door that has opened, a door of awareness and opportunity, enabling us to bravely, solidly, together, make the changes so urgently needed. May we grow and learn together in mutual respect. And now I'll introduce our co-hosts, Tanique Williams of Citizen Action, New York, their communications manager and recently certified nonprofit manager, writer, and video editor, and myself, co-host, Catherine Skopik, chair of Sierra Club New York City Group and its sustainability series that is sponsoring this event. Tanique, before we introduce our speakers, would you like to say a few words?
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here with everybody. I think that this is a perfect time for us to have these conversations around climate justice and the climate crisis, and also to unpack the historical injustices. As we all know, the pandemic has hit Black and Brown communities the hardest, low-income families the hardest. So I think that this is a great opportunity for us to all come together and just kind of unpack these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanique. Thank you, Tanique. And before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to recommend a book to you. I know you're going to be reading this backwards, but at least you can see what it looks like. And it's entitled The U.S. Constitution and the Great Law of Peace, a comparison of two founding documents. Forward by Chief Jake Swamp, comparison by Gregory Schaff, PhD. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and other colleagues, after seeing the Great Law of Peace, incorporated aspects of the Iroquois Confederation of Nations into the constitutions, leaving out one part, the importance of women. But that, of course, is being remedied. Yeah, the women played a very important role in the Iroquois Confederation of Nations. Okay, so I'm going to introduce now our very first speaker, and that's Rick Shaboya, who is Kumeyaay Chicano. And he grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, and earned his BA from Boston University and his MA from Boston College. In 1987, He began a 30-year career in higher education, teaching classes and directing centers and initiatives to advance multiculturalism, racial justice, and institutional decolonization. Perfect for this evening's topic. The positions he has held include Assistant Dean at Yale, where he was founding director of the Native American Cultural Center, Associate Director of the American Council on Education Center for the Advancement of Racial Equality, and Director of New York University's Center for Multicultural Education and Programs. He now serves as a consultant with diverse entities ranging from universities to museums to nonprofit organizations in their efforts to promote equity and inclusion in those institutions. Additionally, Rick has served as board chair for the American Indian Community for the United Nations NGO Committee on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and on the Telluride Institute Board of Trustees. That's quite a bio, Rick. Thank you, Rick. The floor is yours.
Ijan, Catherine, thank you. Auka, Nimiuta Menue, Nyapa, Rick Shaboya, Nishi, Kumia Ipai, Ijan. And I open, that's our protocol, is to introduce ourselves in our Indigenous language, which I do. And I begin this by talking about, in fact, language, because we've been asked, Catherine, and all of our folks have asked us to talk about decolonization. And one of the first steps is to recognize that you are in a land that had myriad languages spoken by Indigenous people, most of which people who are not Indigenous know very little about. And so the first, a good step, which many of you I'm sure have already thought about and perhaps have taken, is to become more familiar with Indigenous languages and even start to learn one. There are ways you can do that online. There's classes that we've offered over the years through the American Indian Community House. There's other resources where you can start to understand not necessarily a fluency in the language, but to understand the importance of language to Indigenous people, which is absolutely central to our culture. And also to just be thinking about the fact that you're on a land, you know, where the European languages that are spoken dominate this country in so many ways. Our school systems, our universities, you know, teach dozens of languages that are based all over the world, except languages that are based here on this land. And one of the things we can do also is think about all of us being advocates to increase the number of language courses in Indigenous language, as well as taking upon ourselves the opportunity to learn more about them. So that's my first remarks about decolonization, is just how important language is to that. And I'll stop for a moment and say that I'm sure there's many things I'm going to mention today, because most of what I'm going to be talking about are very practical. I'm not going to wax philosophically so much. That could be another time where we talk about Indigenous philosophy on some deeper levels. But I think most of you are already aware of a lot of things, and so oftentimes what people talk about is what are some very practical steps we can continue to take or enhance in ways that to continue our decolonization. So that really is, you know, what I'm going to focus more on for the next couple of minutes. Next, what I'll do is I'll thank and give blessings to the Apache Nation and Apache peoples, which is where I've been for the last 2 months in what's known by its colonial name as Arizona. But I've been in the eastern part of Arizona, which is on the Apache Nation. And I give my thanks and blessings to them for allowing me to live and do my work on their land. I also give thanks to the Lenape people as I return back to our residence in New York City on Manhattan. And I thank and give blessings to the Lenape people and nation for again allowing me to reside and to do my work. I also thank all the other Indigenous folks of our community in New York City, which is a very intertribal community, for just always being supportive to this guy from way out west. And I say all this also to also remind everybody that another really significant step to decolonizing is to give land acknowledgements. It's both the way in which you acknowledge Indigenous people on whose land you live and work, and it's also a way to acknowledge your settler status. And that's important because most of the land that you're on throughout Turtle Island is either unceded or was treated through coercion and force. So, you know, it's a way to really think about that. And when you think about that, and if it's something you're going to incorporate in your meetings or already do, in your events, maybe you already do, if you haven't already, I think it's a great way to take a further step to decolonization. You want to do it in an authentic way. And the best way to do it authentically and in a way that's truly you know, part of your understanding of what the acknowledgement is to be in relation with people Indigenous people of that land and who work and live on the land in which you live and work. And oftentimes, I know as an organizational leader here in New York City, people come to us all the time now and ask about land acknowledgements. How do they do them? What should they say? You know, which we think is important if they're thinking about these things. But we also say to them, who do you know? What Indigenous people have you been working with? Have you been in relation with? Have you been taking the time to learn about? Have you been attending any events or any programs? Have you been enhancing your own knowledge about the Indigenous people of your area? And typically, that's where they start to have to really examine whether they've been doing those things. And that's important that when you do think about doing land acknowledgements, that it's built on relations that you're developing with Indigenous people. You don't want it to be something that's being done as performance or just a show in some way to show to display that you're doing the right thing. It's really an acknowledgement that you are in fact in the process of developing or have been in the process of developing good relations with Indigenous people. So I encourage people to do that. And I also encourage people to really do it in a decolonial way, which is to do it in the right way. That means to come in with humility and respect and some understanding of the protocol, with whoever you're working with who's Indigenous and who you're developing relations with, and also to build your knowledge. It's always best, when you're doing any kind of relation building, and in this case, I'm speaking, with the Indigenous community, that you build your own knowledge about those communities and about the history and about what is important to those communities. Because there again, oftentimes people don't know as much as even they may think they know about local Indigenous folks wherever they may be. Certainly New York City, and I'm going to speak from a standpoint of New York City because that is our permanent residence and has been for the last 15 years. Oftentimes people who are incredibly smart, incredibly educated, don't know some of the very most fundamental things about the Indigenous community in New York City. For one, we have 110,000 Indigenous people in New York City. And some people don't know what the composition of that population is, and it's incredibly tribally diverse. Tribal nation diversity is remarkable. And the more you start to understand that yes, we are on Lenape land, but the people who have moved to New York City who are Indigenous, stretch across the globe. And the kinds of organizations are actually historic. For one, the American Indian Community House was founded in 1969, which is the same time a lot of the urban Indian centers were being founded, and it was part of the American Indian movement. So it has a strong, historical roots in a much larger movement, and many of the founders were also Haudenosaunee folks as well as the Lenape folks and Shinnecock folks. So people from the New York and greater New York State area, and they were finding themselves in New York City, off the land, off their quote unquote reservations, and trying to find a better life in the city. And that was the case for a lot of New York Native folks. So that's just one example of the history and the knowledge that you want to really build and understand more as you start to move forward, organizationally. The other is in terms of building knowledge, and I don't and I mean this in the most humble way, is that we all need to do this. We need to really find ways to build the knowledge that was absent in our school systems and still are absent in our school systems. I talk to young people all the time, and typically Native American history, literature, city planning, whatever the case may be about our knowledge is in these brown boxes, these shaded boxes on the side of a textbook. So it's not something embedded as if it was a really central part of the history and the literature and the learning that goes on in the schools. It's more sort of a footnote, if you will. And it's changed to some degree, and there's certainly some schools who make it a bigger part of the curriculum, but still not a great deal. So oftentimes we have to take it upon ourselves to, in a very serious way, learn about that history and know about the major, certainly in the beginning, the major and fundamental values, the major and fundamental events, major and fundamental movements of Native people, of Indigenous people. And I could go into a lot now, but I only have a few minutes. So what I'll say to you is anybody who this strikes a chord with, anybody who's in this learning process now and would love to have more resources or more references, I would be very happy to give that to you and to certainly make sure you're connected to other people who could give you more, more leads on how you can, how you can really enhance your knowledge around these things. The other thing I would say is, when it comes to building relations, you really do want to keep in mind what's the really core of our beliefs as Indigenous people. And first and foremost is in fact humility. And I could do a whole session on humility, but the one thing I'll say is that, as you all know, it's a verb, not a noun. It's the way in which you move throughout life. It's the way in which you move throughout this, this earth and along with others. The next I would make sure that people really understand is sovereignty and self-determination. And sovereignty isn't a concept. It's something we fight for every single day. It's something we've lost at times. It's something that's been in some respects taken from us, not from our real consciousness, not from our elders' teachings, but in very real daily ways. Our sovereignty has been removed, and we have fought back for that. We've found ways through laws. We've found ways through our own acts of economic growth and education and culture to really express and exert our sovereignty. And there's amazing stories of that. And I would really encourage you to learn those amazing stories, to find out what we've done around tribal colleges, and how we developed our own educational systems through tribal colleges and universities, the way we're revitalizing language, the way we're having language schools in our own indigenous languages for our young people. After a history of boarding schools that lasted over 100 years. And those of you who know the history of boarding schools, as indigenous people, almost all of us have been impacted directly by boarding schools through our families. And boarding schools did everything that we're trying to rebuild now. They attempted to take our language, they attempted to take our culture, they attempted to take the way in which we dress and the way we carry ourselves, and every aspect of our life. They tried to take that from us. Just as many times in history, the same thing was happening. In the 50s and 60s, you probably know about the termination policy, often called the Relocation Act. And during termination policies in the 50s and 60s, the same thing was attempted to assimilate us into the majority culture, take away our language, take away our land, take away our culture. And we've had to fight back from all that, through all these different ways. And so, this is who we are. This is not just our history. This is who we are. These stories, this history, these people who've been our leaders. This is what has been written about us, and the experiences we've had is in the fiber of our very fiber of our being. So in order to decolonize, I would really, really encourage you all to know about these things and to talk about them. And you may already. And I would say continue to do that. And those who know it already, make it a part of your membership. Like, assess your own organization. Find, do the other members know what you know? Are they thinking in the way you're thinking? Are they delving deeper every day and making this a part of their working knowledge? The same way they know the artists and the histories and the herstories and the and and all the kinds of you know, things that have happened that we learn, you know, throughout our lives about U.S. history and about the world around us from a European standpoint. Is that has that become a part of their understanding and their knowledge base and their everyday working knowledge, you know, in the life and work that they lead. And I would encourage you, you know, as leaders, and I know you all are, you're all, you know, just such important folks in your own organizations. I would ask you, part of the decolonization is making these things I'm talking about systemic, making them institutional, making this learning and this knowledge something that's embedded in the work you do and the way in which you think about how you're going to relate to one another and what you're going to set as your goals and so forth. So I think I'm about out of time, but I'm hoping that some of the things that I touched upon, you know, are something that are things that people would have a greater interest in talking about, because each one of the things I just mentioned are obviously long discussions in and of themselves. But what I try to do is I try to just touch on enough things that maybe it'll spark some interest among somebody, where they'll want to explore and think about how to do some of these things to a greater degree. But I'll end with saying that among all the values we have, sovereignty, the land, which is talked about a lot, and we do hold the land sacred. But even within that, keep in mind when we talk about the land, most of us are very place-based. We're very based in a homeland. So yes, all land is important to us, and all land is sacred to us. But the sacredness, oftentimes, to us as Indigenous people, is part of our particular tribal nation, and that's where our medicine is. That's where our origin stories are. You know, we go back to a particular place from where we really connect to a particular place, like I do. You know, which is in Southern California, and certainly Indigenous people, you know, all over Turtle Island and all over the world connect, yes, with the land overall, but they connect in certain ways with very specific land from which they're from, right? And that's something you want to know as well. You want to understand what that means and something about those origin stories and something about those medicines and so forth. But along with that, and I'll end with this, as much as anything, we are relational, not transactional. We are relational. So when we come to people, it's always about building relations in some meaningful, good, respectful, humble way. It's not to get something out of it. You know, it's not for exchange, which is one of the biggest. That was one of the biggest misunderstandings. You know, and still is between Europeans, you know, people of sort of more, you know, European-based philosophy and Indigenous philosophy, is the relational part and how truly deep and fundamental that is to us. And so I say that so that I encourage you all to continue building relations with Indigenous people, build relations with Indigenous organizations. And the best way to do that is to understand who they are, who we are, what's important to us, what our causes are, what the issues that are most important to us, what are our programs, you know, and they're abundant. We have, just here in New York City alone, there's organizations, you know, Indigenous organizations throughout New York City, and you can become a part of those in many ways. There are some things that we have that are specifically for the Indigenous community, but many, in fact, most of what we do, certainly with the American Indian Community House, with a lot of the other organizations that are operating here in New York City, as well as the state and you know, throughout the country, have public, you know, programs and educational types of events, and you're welcome to come, and that's the way in which you can find out what are we speaking of from our perspective. You hear our voice. We lead the programs. We're the people that determine what it is that's gonna be presented, and you can come and participate, and then from there you can start to understand, well, you know, how can I start to build relations with, you know, with these folks, with these communities, with these people, and that's, that's a really important way, is to really come to understand who we are and what we do, and then from there, you can really find ways, and we're always happy, to find ways to build partnerships and to build relations. So I'll end with that, and I thank you all for listening.
Thank you, Rick. That was so beautiful. I'm happy to learn about the schools for children, your youth learning the language. A comment and another comment and something from the chat. Sierra Club Atlantic Chapter, that's New York State. We have 4 meetings during the year, each in a different location of New York State. And we always open the meetings. Our chair always opens the meetings with a land acknowledgement. So I'm glad you reminded me of that again, because we need to do more of that. And at some point, maybe in the chat, you could put a good source of Lenape information, because at one point I was doing that and trying to get different facts about Lenape and not just repeating the same things. So if you could put in the chat a source for Lenape knowledge, I would appreciate that.
I'll try. I'm not good at multitasking, and there's so many. I don't want to prioritize one over the other. But Catherine, I would just say that that's another good time to say that, yes, there's certainly all sorts of sources, but there's no better source than us. There's no better way to learn about who we are than to come and build relations with us and have conversation with us and come to our programs, and come to our events and come to our talks and come to our socials and our powwows and things like that. And I know a lot of times people are a little hesitant to do that because they think, well, there's not very many non-Indigenous folks and maybe I'm intruding. No, actually, we'd like you to come, and we'd like you, frankly, to be a minority. We'd like you to be in a situation where you are, in fact, just a small number of the people who are there, because that's most of our life when we go outside of our community. Yeah. I mean, I've been on Zoom after Zoom, and there's usually about 3 of us Indigenous folks among 60 faces when we have these big Zoom meetings. So we're in that situation all the time. So one of the ways to decolonize is put yourself in a space where you are, in fact, a minority, if you will, racially or culturally. And I know many of you do that already, but the more times you can do that, you learn so much in that way. You learn so much just, when you're in a place where the knowledge and the activities are being directed by, in this case, I'm speaking, of course, of Indigenous folks, where we're directing it, and you're having a chance to participate and learn. It's a good place to be.
Thanks, Rick. We'll have to invite. We have a Lenape chief in Ramapo, New Jersey. We'll have to hear more from him.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's another good thing, Catherine, is to have elders like that, speak and share their knowledge.
Yeah.
And when you go to elders, as people know, if you do go to elders, make sure you know the protocol. Bring gifts. Do the things that just, the respectful things that need to be done when you engage with elders.
Thank you, Rick. We have one comment here I'll read from Ryan. And Ryan says in the chat, on language, I just started an Algonquin language course at Stony Brook University, and we're reading this really great book about language revitalization efforts, which I'd recommend. And he has the website here to recommend.
Right on.
What?
It's happening all over.
Yeah.
Language revitalization is one of the biggest movements right now among Indigenous folks.
Right. Thank you so much, Rick. And we'll have time for more questions toward the end of the program. That was absolutely excellent. We all have so much to learn. Our next speaker would have been, and I love to say his name because it is so musical. It's Roberta Mccarro Barraro. It almost sounds very poetic, but we just got a message that something came up with Roberto. He will not be able to be speaking, so we'll have more time for more questions, and I hope Roberto is all right. So now what I'd like to do is to hand it over to our co-host, Tanique Williams, who will introduce our next speakers. Tanique?
Yes, hey everyone. So the next speaker is going to be Tanzania. Um, Tanzania is a Citizen Action statewide board member. So I'm just going to read a little bit from her bio. So Tanzania is a South Bronx native and has been passionate about youth development in the arts since she was 13 years old. Ms. Hughie is a graduate of the New York Conservatory for Dramatic Arts and an alumni of Virginia Commonwealth University. She is currently a freelance writer and has her own company, Tanzania Hughie Productions. As I mentioned before, she's on the statewide board member for Citizen Action, and she calls herself an artivist. She's so basically, you know, art and activism, where that meets at. And so I'm going to actually pass it over to Tanzania now. She's going to talk about further about decolonization and also like historical trauma in the Black community.
Thank you, Tanique. Good evening, everybody. So I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's discussion. When we discuss this decolonization and what that looks like, we need to first define it in parts. Wikipedia describes it as the undoing of colonialism, and it later begins to process where the nation established and maintains its domination overseas territories. So decolonization would be a nation becoming sovereign. I love how Rick, tied that all in. Sovereign from that nation's rule and being able to govern themselves as they see fit. May I submit to you that not only does that territory need to be relieved from oppression systematically, but the people's psychological bindings must be broken as well. The minds of those oppressed people need freedom from the emotional trauma, the mental and physical rigor that goes along with colonization. Decolonization in America happened in the 1700s, but we as Black people are still decolonizing our minds from being dominated by our colonizers daily. It is still ongoing because we still deal with systematic racism and oppression. So, no, we're not still enslaved and working on plantations anymore. However, we're still living under some sort of restraint, making it difficult to gain sovereignty and totality over oneself and truly being decolonized. Constantly being told where you can live, redlining, where ones can go to school, socioeconomic status, where one can work based on education, and how much one can make based off of gender and race. And then also what school another one can go to because of improper funding for education. All those are determined by the color of your skin. This making it a constant mental gymnastics for the development of tools to repair one's psyche from the trauma of over 400 years of slavery and the following years of systematic oppression. Decolonization must first break down the racism of years of discrimination and hatred amongst ourselves, unpacking years of divide and conquer on plantation and shadeism, colorism, things like that. Learning to love everything about being Black, from different strands of curly, kinky hair to every lavish hue of brown. Unprogramming Black girls from being grown up and allowing themselves to be a child, ultimately understanding that during slavery, Black girls were seen as breeders and they had to, at a very young age, mate and were told that they had to be a woman before it was their time. Decolonizing our minds to stop thinking that we always have to work hard to prove to others that we're worth it. Because, you can have more than one excellent Black person at work. For the rest of the world, especially America, making those connections look like reparations for the descendants of free slaves, restorative justice for the Black people who are wrongfully incarcerated, stopping the systematic racism and oppression of Black people, monitoring and correcting large and microaggressions. Literally just this weekend, I was at a hotel and someone from the white community thought I was the help. And I got berated by another person in the community for helping out another organizer. So even organizers are dealing with constant berating from other organizers. Being a Black woman organizer while fighting for rights in the Black community is even still hard. Having to decolonize and having to deal with being traumatized and the lack of being trauma-informed is something that we have to break down systematically. We can see from recent interactions throughout our country that decolonization needs to happen in the white people's mind as well. The ability to not see Black people as servants or property, to inherently assume that you as a white person have the right to police or to tell a Black person what to do is ludicrous, and that thought process needs to be decolonized. We have seen reports in the news and in social media outlets that, you know, in the white community is often imposing themselves onto Black people, inciting and igniting fear that shouldn't be there. The infamous Barbecue Becky and the Central Park dog walker are all dangerous accounts where decolonization of the mind and sociopathic spaces need restoration. Targeting Black people, making fraudulent reports because you know the system works in the favor of your privilege are just a few situations where the deprogramming of one's psyche is imperative to true sovereignty of the Black community and making the connections of racial justice and the decolonization of Black people.
Wow.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
It's really important.
Yeah. You know, it's good to have conversations that are uncomfortable, because I think we have to do more and more of this because it involves us all. We each have something different to work on to accomplish this, you know, both Black and white, as you say. So being able to comfortably talk about uncomfortable topics is very important. And I think you kind of helped that along with your approach in this talk. I know for me, anyway, you have, and that was wonderful. Okay, Rick says, thank you, Tanzania. That was terrific.
Oh, thank you, Rick.
Do you have any specific suggestions, like say one suggestion?
I think that trying to decolonize your mind from like making those connections is something that can't happen overnight. If, like Rick said, if you're not putting yourself in spaces where you are the minority. So oftentimes in the Black community, you know, our culture is American culture, whether we want to admit it or not. Our music is widely loved and adored, but we as the people are not widely loved and adored. From rock, from hip hop, from pop, like we have, our food is loved, our dances are loved, our everything about us is loved except for us. And it seems as if we could just be loved as beings that, you know, it would be a lot easier to get along. And it really has to be an individual thing. I feel as if in time, it radically needs to just say, hey, we like you. It doesn't seem like it needs to be a hard thing. But I think intentionally, you need to think in your mind, hey, these people are not bad. And I think the stereotype that keeps being perpetuated and was very early on with movies coming from the White House, making it seem like Black people were, raping white women, like, that those stereotypes were very much ingrained and embedded in our culture. So of course, it's programming. It's still in our brains. We need to deprogram, our minds from thinking that Black people are bad, or Black people are going to rape you, or Black people are going to kill you, or Black people are going to steal from you. It's just not in our nature to do harm. Harm comes from people that have lack. So if you put people systematically in spaces and you take things away from them, then they will do X, Y, and Z. But it's kind of like a recurring cycle. So if you continue to oppress people, then they will lash out. So if we put everybody in a space where there is no oppression, there is no racism, there is, we all, kumbayaing, for lack of better words, then we'll be at a space where we're all even, we're all equal, we're on a level playing ground. And we can really see who we are. I think Rick touched well on being in spaces and learning of our culture. The problem is that a lot of Black culture is American culture, and having to be a white person in America is also having to understand that, Black people were hoes, we were lynched, we were killed, we were chained, we were beaten, we were broken, we were, stuffed in bags, we were turned into furniture. All the horrific things actually happened. And then saying, we apologize, reparations. It seems as if, there's been a problem ever since, we stopped being a free labor. It's been hatred since then. And I think those things need to be deprogrammed, because we're not property. We are living beings. And those are the ideals that really, from a Black person's perspective, bug you out. You go, I'm a real person, right? I'm alive and I have thoughts and feelings. Even I was just in Rochester, and the energy in Rochester during the protests, when I got there, I heard the police. First you hear, okay, like Daniel Prude was, he was pretty much hooded. So hooded means like he was suffocated. But then you hear after he was hooded that, people came out to protest, and people in wheelchairs were knocked down by the police. And there's this idea that people are not human anymore. So I think that I very much adopt like the indigenous idea that we need to get back to our earth. We need to get back to our grounding. We need to get back to honoring earth and honoring our souls and honoring each other, because we're losing it. And because we're losing it, we're getting out of touch with each other. We're getting out of touch with Mother Earth, and we're losing the fact that we're all here together. And then it makes it very hard to connect and see each other as one, and then also see each other as individuals. We're individuals that have, minds, and we come with baggage, and we come with lives, and we come with past hurts, and we need to bring that to the forefront when you meet people and you decide to say, hello or not speak. Those are all things that play into it. So I think meeting a person where they are, not by their skin, and actually trying to get to know a person and not by a stereotype. I can't tell you how many times I'm met because of my skin tone or because of my hair, and not actually met because of who I am. And I think that should be the first thing, meeting someone because of who they are.
Wow. That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Tanzania. Wow, love it. It's much more fun to have fun, right? And get along and get to know one another, and we can have fun together.
Try. Can we try?
Enjoy life. It doesn't have to be bad. It could be good.
We're tired. I think also, sorry to cut you off, we're also tired. I think that it's been a whole lot of years, and I think that, you know, we want to hang out too. We want to hang out on yachts. We want to eat food and not protest. We want to not go to funerals. You know, this Labor Day, I didn't get to enjoy Labor Day. I just thought about that. I was protesting the same things that my forefathers were protesting, the same exact things. So at a certain point, it's like, you know, can we just all get along? Like, eventually, can we get to a place where, you know, we're not primitive, where we all are honoring each other and honoring our land and honoring our planet, because we only have one.
Yay. Amen. Excellent. Okay. That was beautiful, Tanzania.
Is Bob next?
And Tanique, we're going to hear from you introducing our next speaker.
Yes, so I'm going to be introducing Bob Cohen, who is the policy director at Citizen Action. He works on climate issues as well as health issues. So I didn't get a chance to do, I was supposed to do this in the beginning, but just a little brief about Citizen Action. Citizen Action is a multi-issue progressive organization that advocates for social, racist, economic, and environmental justice. We have 8 regional chapters throughout New York State. We're nationally affiliated with People's Action, and we are a membership organization. We also work on mass incarceration, education issues, housing, healthcare, and also the state and federal budget. So, and then, yeah, so we're gonna introduce Bob, if Bob is ready.
Yes, also, Tanzania is going to do the beginning of the PowerPoint, right?
Yeah, I just have to, I'm gonna share my screen so I can present the PowerPoint. So.
Oh, can you do the screen share, Tanique?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so, yep, actually we are gonna start, I'm sorry, Tanzania, we actually are gonna start with Tanzania. I'm sorry, you guys, so.
It's fine.
So yeah, we have the first slide here. Wait. Okay.
Okay, this is New York City, which was the epicenter of the virus. The age adjusted mortality per 100,000 population was 122 for white people and 109 for Asian people. It was 238 for Latinx and 244 for African Americans. Rates of non-fatal cases in New York City were also far higher for African Americans and Latinx than for whites.
Never mind, it's working. Sorry.
Oops, sorry about that. And then we have the the source here, but oops, basically we're highlighted. Oops, okay, sorry.
Y'all don't want to know the source.
There you go.
For Black and Brown and Indigenous communities, the climate crisis arrived decades ago in the form of air and water pollution, contaminated land, and lead and mold in homes. Corporate polluters have made enormous profits by treating communities of color as dumping grounds for their waste. Oil and gas CEOs have put their personal profits before the health and safety of our children, seniors, and community members. Fossil fuels plants and pipelines are often cited in Black and Brown low-income communities, not only contributing to the climate crisis, but causing pollution and chronic health disease like asthma and other respiratory illnesses. Lead poisoning and asthma in Black and Brown and low-income communities hurt the ability of children to focus in school and receive the quality education they deserve.
So I guess this is my part. Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say that I'm sorry I was not able to hear Rick's presentation. I got pulled into another meeting, but I'm glad this is being recorded because what I did hear and certainly what I heard from Tanzania was also really, really important and had an impact on me. And I certainly will listen to it later on. And I also want to say that clearly we're switching to almost a different dimension in that I'm going to more practical policy stuff, and I'm not discounting what has said before, but I think it's important to acknowledge that you know what law can do and what political action can do can address some, but not all of the issues that have been discussed. So we're all multi-dimensional people, and just wanted to make you aware that I know the transition is a little awkward. I'll be talking almost entirely about the politics in New York State of climate policy. So I am, and Citizen Action is, and if I could mention him, Ryan, who's on this call, was glad to see you, Ryan, on this call, is also on the steering committee of New York Renews, which is as the slide says, a unique coalition of environmentalists, community groups, and unions with nearly 200 member organizations. We're the largest, I believe, coalition that's addressing climate change, but as this slide shows, we are not just addressing climate change in the narrow sense of global warming, as critically important as that is. I don't think I need to tell anybody on this call. You just need to look. I'm sure you all consume the news. So this very week and last week, you're seeing the fires in California. Every week, really, there's something to illustrate why we need to take action to address the climate crisis. But New York News, informing a few years ago, from its inception, and it's become, I don't know if the word is fashionable, but it's become more visible to talk about climate in an intersectional way. But New York News, from its beginning, emphasized issues not just about the environment in the narrow sense of that word, but also using the needed transformation we need to have to a renewable energy economy as a means to transform so much of our society's economy and relationships. And I think that this is what this slide shows. I'm not going to read it all. I'm just going to mention a couple of them, the bullet points that you hopefully see. Climate change represents a serious threat to all, especially to vulnerable people. And I think the most important thing that I want to say, and we'll move on to the next slide, is we can, and I probably should modify this slide to say we must address both the climate crisis and the inequality crisis together. As we'll see later on, and I think most people here know, you can't talk about transforming to, addressing climate change without addressing the disproportionate consequences of the climate crisis and pollution and other phenomena that have already been talked about, and other things like inadequate housing, without, you have to address all of them together. Next slide. New York Renews, our coalition, from its beginning, sought to break the barriers between traditional environmentalists, and I think most people know the stereotype. Typically, although not always, it tends to be white folks and more high-income people, and that's the stereotype. But there's also, unfortunately, quite a bit of truth in that. And New York Renews was formed by a number of organizations that wanted to, from the beginning, emphasize a much more broader social justice agenda. And this is just a selection of some of the organizations that are in New York Renews and in its leadership as a way of, put it up here to illustrate that our coalition reflects our political goals. So yes, we have some of the major environmental organizations that have carried the fight for years, including Sierra Club, and Environmental Advocates, which is the leading lobbying group on a whole host of environmental issues in the state legislature in Albany. But also from the beginning, we've had what you might call community organizing organizations, such as ours, Citizen Action, Working Families Party. The third category is people of color or environmental justice groups that tend to focus on the impact of systemic racism, particularly when it comes to climate, in particular neighborhoods, or in some cases, in the case of New York City, Environmental Justice Alliance, in particular regions. Some labor unions, we'd like more, groups that have fought pipelines throughout the state, and faith groups, and I probably should add to this slide youth groups, which is an increasing focus of our organizing. Next slide. Like to give a really, really top line 30,000-foot level summary of what we've accomplished as New York Renews. The major legislation we've championed is called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. As you can see from the slide, it used to have a different name. And the reality is, and we like to tell people this, that the reason the name change is Governor Cuomo wanted to, frankly, take credit for this legislation. So he gave a different name when the final shaping of the legislation. That's fine with us. We're not about credit, but it's just important. It sort of illustrates politics in Albany and how it works. Certainly one of the most important parts of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, of the CLCPA, is the climate mandate. We have to address the fact that we're facing an existential crisis, which is going to impact all of us, all of our civilization, as the fires in California illustrate more than anything else this particular week. We seek to, or the law mandates, an 85% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And I'm not going to get into net zero. This is not a policy presentation, but suffice to say that we need to get, and under the law, we need to get above 85%. And the law sets this goal. And there's also goals for what percentage of our electricity that we consume, both homes and businesses, is renewable. And you see the goals here. 100% of electricity must come from renewable energy sources by 2040, which is only about 20 years away. Next slide, please. Probably the most important economic justice, racial justice provision of the CLCPA, although I would say that, you know, we have to address the climate crisis and it impacts everybody, but the specifically targeted remedies in the CLCPA, there are several. One of them is that 35% of the benefits of spending of state energy spending must directly impact so-called disadvantaged communities. I don't particularly like that term. A lot of us don't, but that's the term they put in the law, with a target of 40%. What does that mean, disadvantaged communities? Well, a state entity has to define it, but essentially what it means in the law is communities with low income, high unemployment, that have a history, have been subject to race discrimination, and communities that are vulnerable to climate change and or environmental pollution. And when you think about it, if you know anything about climate justice, what you'll find is this is so many, if not all of the Black and brown communities in New York State face this because, as Tanzania said, and we'll go into in a minute also, we have always cited polluting plants and fossil plants disproportionately in low income communities and neighborhoods and communities of color all around the state. So though the funding that would be provided can be spent for a number of purposes, and I've listed some of them, like weatherization, energy efficiency, that our communities need. And the vision of New York Renews is that we're going to use the money as those communities want within the parameters that I've listed here. So our idea is to use this funding not only to address climate change, but to allow people to make decisions as to how their community should be, and use the funding in such a way that they can revive their communities in a way that is the way that is desired by the people who live in those communities. Next slide. So I wanted to give just a couple of quick examples of so-called disadvantaged communities. Again, we're going to have to define that, but it gives you sort of a better picture, or hopefully a clearer picture of what we're talking about. So throughout the state, as the slide says, Black and brown communities have been harmed worse by pollution and fossil fuel plants. In Albany, in the community near which I live, they proposed to build a fracked gas plant, or actually there still is a fracked gas plant right near the state capitol in a neighborhood called the Sheridan Hollow neighborhood. You can literally see it from the assembly chamber in the state capitol. It's that close. And it also has a history of the Answers plant, which was a trash machine plant, a plant that burned garbage that caused asthma and all other respiratory problems in the neighborhood. And you see the demographics here. Sheridan Hollow, the immediate neighborhood, has the 6th lowest average household income of the 25 Albany neighborhoods that are defined. You see the Black population in Arbor Hill, which is the neighboring neighborhood to Sheridan Hollow. Is 4 out of 5 are Black people. Sheridan Hollow, 2 out of 3. West Side in Buffalo, which has problems with diesel trucks that are going over the Peace Bridge into Canada, has a median household income of $23,766. Needless to say, way below the average income in New York State. Well, it has a significant Black and Hispanic population. Sunset Park in Brooklyn, where they've proposed to, not proposed, they've built in the early 2006 so-called peaker plants that basically are available when hot summers, when we need to back up the existing power grid. They're, in the 80s, they were really, really dirty. In the 2000s, they became a little less dirty, but they still are major sources of pollution. And there's a campaign there. Colleagues of ours in New York News, UPROSE, and New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and other organizations are trying to shut these peaker plants because there are high levels of asthma and extremely poor air quality in that neighborhood. And you can see the demographics there. More than 1 of every 4 of that neighborhood are below the poverty level, the federal poverty level. Next slide. So what will the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act do to protect those communities? Well, one of them I already said, which it'll provide the 30% of energy funding. But another thing the law does is it requires that if you're going to build anything, particularly fossil fuel plants in that community or various other state projects, when the state lets out contracts, it turns out New York State is a major driver of economic activity. So if you're going to do any of those things, it doesn't stop necessarily fossil fuel plants in the short term, although I believe it stops them in the long term, given the climate goal of 85% or 100% by 2050. But it doesn't immediately ban them, but it says a couple of things on the climate screen. It says you have to consider whether the project you're building is inconsistent with attainment of the greenhouse gas emission goals. In English, what that means is that if we're going to try to reduce greenhouse gases, then it's hard to imagine how building a new fossil fuel plant will be able to be done. So it gives us as climate activists an ability to challenge the permit, and we can maybe slow it down or maybe even stop it entirely. The equity screen requires an inquiry as to whether building this plant will disproportionately burden disadvantaged communities. And we need to prioritize greenhouse gas reductions. If you think about it a second, I would say anytime you put a plant in a low-income people of color community, then you're going to disproportionately burden them. We'll see how the law is interpreted, but I think it's going to be a powerful weapon to stop plants and pipelines in those communities. Next slide. One of the new things that New York Renews is going to be promoting, and it's a very complex law. I'm not going to get into it now because I know we want to have some time for discussion. But I want to let people know about it, is we're writing legislation that's now called the Climate and Community Investment Act that's going to provide far more funding for not just low-income people of color communities, but communities throughout the state. Because we know that capitalism and the economy as it is today is not going to transition to renewables without a substantial infusion of public money. We just know that. And we're unapologetic about that. We built the fossil fuel economy, and as I think most people know, we built a fossil fuel economy with subsidies. The interstate highway system was not built privately. It was built in the 50s with public money. So we believe to make the kind of transformation, we have to have massive expenditures. And the way we want to do it is by placing a polluter fee on greenhouse gases in New York State. And unlike some proposals, some which are sometimes called carbon tax, we prefer to call it polluter fee. This is not a revenue neutral proposal. We do want to kick some of the money back to offset the anticipated increased costs of people when it comes to their cars, et cetera. But we also believe that we need to do substantial investment, and that this legislation is a means to do that. We anticipate in the first few years that $7 billion will be raised each year. And here's some of the things that people can be able to spend them for. First, large-scale efficiency and renewable energy projects will get roughly 1/3 of the funds. Examples of that would be electric, trains, or improving the transit systems, et cetera. The second category, also roughly around 1/3 of the funding, would be for communities like the ones I described to do various local projects. I'm going to switch to the fourth bullet. 30% of the funds we'd like to go to energy rebates to offset the increased energy cost we believe people will have. And we anticipate that somewhere from the bottom, 60 to 70% of New Yorkers will be made whole, which means your energy bills will go up, at least in the short term, we think, but there will be reimbursement through this fund to address that in various ways. And finally, we know that there are fossil fuel workers who are going to lose their jobs. It's not their fault. They are entitled to earn a living. And there is a fund that we're going to provide so that they can get retraining, early retirement, income for a number of years to ease the transition. I do want to say one thing. Whenever I say this, we see the 7% figure, it sounds like we're not helping fossil fuel workers. It turns out there's not a lot of fossil fuel workers in New York State. So our estimation is that this is more than enough to support the programs we want to support, even though 7% doesn't seem like a lot. So that's the end of my presentation. and happy to take questions or hear discussion.
Oh, thank you, Bob. That was very good. And as you said, the legislation and creating mandates puts the opportunity for these necessary remedies to happen. I just wanted to say, for people who may not be aware, on the federal level, there's a package of about 10 climate bills that will be helping. And there's two, the Climate Equity Act and the Justice for All, both have provisions for a just transition for workers. And this is nationally. So, but it's interesting to think that New York State doesn't have that many fossil fuel workers. Okay, so let's see what are some questions here. Oh, Randy Carr is inviting everybody to come out to the Climate Justice Through Racial Justice March and Rally on September 20th. That's on Sunday, the Sunday before Climate Week. And we're hoping to make this a theme of Climate Week, Climate Justice Through Racial Justice. Let's see if we have a specific question. We have another question here. How can the Sierra Club work more closely with Citizen Action? Sierra Club cannot officially be a part of a coalition because of the way the club is incorporated.
So I'd be happy to take that. Happy to take that question, and yeah, this maybe requires some email to go back and forth. But I will say, I don't know who asked that question.
Irene, she's
Irene,
within the
my
Sierra
email
Club.
is bcohen@citizenactionny.org. So if you want to email me, and we can have a back and forth. But just for your information, Irene, Sierra Club is a member of the New York Renews Coalition. So I'm not quite sure what you mean that you can't join coalitions. Sierra Club is a participant in our coalition.
Yeah. It had to be approved by the national office. So if they did that, then
Yeah. Okay. So, but it was, and they are active in our coalition. But I welcome members of Sierra Club to be involved with Citizen Action individually as well. And we have chapters throughout the state. You should go on our webpage. It lists all of them. And I know that I myself work very closely with Sierra Club members on my climate work. And
You work with Roger, right?
I work with Roger. I work with several members of the local Sierra Club chapter very frequently.
Thank you, Bob. I see now, maybe then rather than taking them off the chat, if somebody would like to raise their hand and ask a question, unmute. If somebody would like to ask a question of Rick, Tanzania, or Bob, raise your hand, and we can take a few questions here, okay? And while people are thinking of their questions, let's see if we have another one on the chat. Okay. Let's see. Rick said to everyone, we also lost many beautiful people to COVID. This is Indigenous, from our Indigenous community. Yes, reparations, and also land back and rematriation. While people are thinking of their questions, in regard to support, the Navajo Nation had tremendous problems with COVID. And also, I don't know if you've ever heard of downwinders, the people in New Mexico who were dying from radiation sickness because of all the testing of nuclear weapons. Everybody else in New Mexico receives support on a monthly basis from the United States. However, Indigenous people are not eligible for those. So there is a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of making good on some of these wrongs that have been done. Okay, anybody else have a question? You can raise your hand. And let's see if anybody else has a question. Okay, would any of our speakers like to ask a question of another speaker? Okay, I'm going to ask each of our speakers to respond to this question, and Bob, will start with you and go backwards the other way. What is one thing that we might do to enable making the connections between climate crisis, racial injustice, and decolonization? What's one thing that we might be able to do for ourselves and to help bring others along on this journey?
So I have to say, quite honestly, I was prepared with this question, but I'm still a little bit stumped as to what to say. One thing, but I will say this, that as a long-term political activist, I was taught at a young age that all of these issues, racism, you can go down, climate, quite honestly, when I was young, I was not aware of, but climate, inadequate access to resources, educational inequity, they all had a common root. I don't think I have time to sort of articulate what that system is. Some people say capitalism, some people say racial capitalism, but I think the most important thing I'll say, because I really, want to respect the question and take it seriously, is that we can't do what we did. I'm 62. We can't do what we did, the progressive movement, when I was young, when I was in my 20s, which is think of ourselves as climate activists, as education activists, as housing activists. We must find ways to connect our concerns with everybody else's concerns. We're all here on the same earth. And all of the problems really are connected. And there are practical problems with that because, legislation is written to address one issue and not the other. So if I have to commit myself and say, what is the one thing to do, is if you're an organization that doesn't specifically focus on race, then take the opportunity to work with people in your community that are doing that, or take the opportunity to look at your issue that you're working on from what is sometimes called the racial justice lens. So for example, I worked on education with Citizen Action for a number of years, and we used to talk more about more money for schools in general. And now we, meaning Alliance for Quality Education and Citizen Action, are much more explicit in saying that schools that have a high proportion of Black and brown kids are entitled to more funding. And we dig much deeper into the needs of those particular schools. So hopefully my answer wasn't too long. Work on racial justice, whatever hat you're wearing as a progressive.
Wow. Thank you, Bob. Thank you. That's great. And now we'll go to Tanzania. What is a thing? It doesn't have to be the one, but what is one thing that we can be doing to bring for our own selves, for our own awareness, and also to help bring others along?
As far as decolonization, I think that I touched on it earlier. I think that it's very much in line with what Rick was saying. To echo those words is that, we're really not sovereign. And I'm laughing because it's not laughable, but that's how we get over things, is making light of it. But it's because it's a coping skill. I think that change laws. And I often have this conversation about, I keep hearing, oh, it's going to take a long time. And I go, no, it's not. It doesn't have to. It really does. We put people in place that will change laws and fix things. These are like human rights issues. These things shouldn't still be going on. The indigenous people of this land should not have to deal with radioactive waves. They should not be subject to food deserts because they're not living amongst the same food that they grew up and learned and lived and ate. Do we understand that indigenous people are not eating the same foods that they used to eat because they've been forced off their land? Like, it's just simple things that we need to do. It's stop. Stop. And it sounds really simple, but I feel as if I say this often, but I go, and then I get angry, and I often think that people honestly don't care. Because if people honestly cared, then we wouldn't be where we are right now. If Bob cared about Tanzania as much as Tanzania cared about Bob, and if Rick cared about Bob as much as Tanzania cared about Bob, and if we all just cared a little bit more about each other in a certain way, certain things wouldn't happen. But I think that the first thing that we could do is see each other as beings and not as doings. And that is the culture here in America, is that we are very catered to our capitalistic ways, that we are doing. We're batteries. We must do. We must work to do. We must work to do this. We must work to buy this, instead of living and doing things to be present, to be alive, to be accountable, to be a good neighbor to each other, to be lovers, to be caretakers of our land, to be caretakers of each other. I think that should be the first thing that we start with, is being present for each other. And I don't know if that's on everyone's docket of things to master. Is one of the things that, after you have all the money in the world, we are still lacking peace. You see people that have a lot of money and they still lack peace. They still lack understanding. They go out and they search the whole entire world for something that is very eternal. It's very internal. It's the very thing that we have the least control and the most control over, which is peace. Just reach out and grab it and try to find it internally, and then everything else in your life just kind of goes, oh, well, that makes sense. Just give them land and make sure they have food, and I'll make sure that I have food, and certain things just start to click in when you find inner peace. And I think inner peace and caring for others go hand in hand.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Tanzania.
I hope that made sense without sounding all...
No, that comparison between being and doing is kind of...
Yeah, no, it's a spiritual dialogue that I gained in spiritual practice, and then it's something that I adopted, and it very much is, it helped me to slow down and I need to work on it more. I think we all do, but especially when you start to travel and you meet other people, when you meet, especially so I'm a Black woman from America. When I meet a Black woman from somewhere else, their ideology of who they are is totally different, and they see the world totally different. So when you have discussions and you meet people from different customs and cultures, you recognize the similarities, and then you also recognize the differences in how you think. And then when you have those conversations, you end up saying how much we don't know, and how much we are alike, and how much we need to be instead of do.
Okay. Thank you, Tanzania. That was very, very insightful. Tanique, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot, but would you
Put
like
her on the spot. Don't be mad at me.
say a word about how we can address climate crisis, racial injustice, and decolonization within ourselves and maybe bring other people along? What's something that might help us in this process?
I think that everyone here pretty much hit the nail on the head, but if I do to add to that, I think it is like Tanzania said, like us kind of censoring ourselves and just kind of like trying to do the right things and just kind of really understanding the historical. I think that when we understand the historical trauma and when we understand because even with COVID, we saw that COVID impacted Black and Brown communities the worst. And I think that even when we looked at like the majority of the essential workers were Black and Brown, like from certain demographics, were predominantly Black and Brown. So I think when we just kind of, when more people understand the historical trauma and the root causes of things, I think that we're able to come to the solutions. So I feel like conversations like this and bringing all the different perspectives, and then also like Bob touched on the policy aspect of it, because we do have to fight to get the laws changed. We do have to fight for policy that's going to protect not only human life, but our environment. Our environment is what sustains us. So I think that, you know, it's important to tie all of those things together, but mainly understanding that the root causes and how trauma not only affects our physical bodies, but the trauma that we experience in the environment a lot of times, and which people said was a contributor to the statistics and stuff like that was a contributor to certain communities being impacted worse by COVID. So we know that there's a lot of, even just mentioning the food deserts, you know, people not having access to healthy food, and all of these things play a role in how our bodies function. So I think that like seeing the earth, like Tanzania touched on and Rick touched on, and, you know, seeing all of these things as kind of a whole part of who we are as people, and connecting the policy to the human issues, which I think everyone here does a really good job at. So yeah, that's pretty much it. I think this was an amazing discussion today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's beautiful, Tanique. And last but not least, Rick, thought of one thing or something that we can do to increase our own awareness of the interconnectedness of climate, racial injustice, and decolonization for ourselves and to help bring others along?
Well, first, we're speaking with an audience who I think probably thinks about these things all the time. So I guess I would say one thing is we could do is maybe just continue to reach out to people who maybe don't think about this all the time, and in fact maybe don't even consider this way of life that we know needs to take place, where we are in fact merging all these, you know, these movements of justice. It may not even be something that they consider all that important, and I know we all do that already, but probably just spend a little more time speaking to those folks, even though sometimes it's difficult, because you sometimes are met with indifference, you're sometimes met with resistance. We still have a lot of people who frankly don't necessarily believe a lot of what we know to be true about racial justice and climate justice and so forth. And that's what I think our powers of love and insight and patience and humility all need to come together. And we need to have those conversations with folks that we know are not necessarily, you know, finding these things to be important in their lives, or they have so many other pressing issues, so many other, frankly, life and death kinds of issues that they're dealing with in a very immediate sense, that it's hard for them to give the time, you know, to the issues that we're talking about. It doesn't mean they ignore them. It just means that there's an immediacy around them in terms of what they're facing, that it's difficult. So we got to just wrap our arms around those people and make them part of who we are, and make sure they know that we care about them and that we understand that they're not always able to give the time that we are able to give in some of the ways that we give, but they're giving their time in all sorts of other ways that are just as human, just as vital. So I mean, that's I guess one thing I would say. And the other is just repeat what's been said already, is that just keep going back to our relations that are non-human and learn from them, you know, and be educated by them. Because when I go out and I spend time with my relations, whether my relations are flying or floating or crawling on the ground or standing as mountains or you know, just forever just being who they are and branching out and dropping leaves on us, and whoever our relations may be who are not human, we just not just spend time but learn and make sure that we have an ear to listen and learn, because our relations have great insights, and sometimes they give us ideas and strength that keep us moving in directions we need to be moving.
Oh, thank you, Rick. That was absolutely wonderful. And yes, it seems that all of us here this evening recognize that despite all the negative impacts coming in on us from our culture, from the way things are in the world today in general, that there is a higher way of living or a better way of living that is beyond those negative impacts on us every day. So the more we are able to rise above them and give the love and caring, forgiveness, humility that you mentioned, Rick, that is so important, the more we are able to rise above all the negative impacts in our lives from others or from whatever, the better off we will be, the better examples we will be to others. And if we can become the people we need to be to accomplish these goals, I think that in and of itself will help bring others along. So I want to thank each and every one of you tonight as speakers, because you have been inspiring. And I know you've given me some insights and thoughts, and I will be watching this again. And for your interest, this has been recorded, and we'll get it up on our Sierra Club website at some point, so that if you want to share it with friends who are unable to watch this evening, you will be able to do that. So as soon as I get that link, I will email it out to all of you. So I just wish I could say thank you enough, but you have moved me greatly. And I thank you all. And unless anybody has anything else to say, Rick or Bob, did you put your hand up? Or just goodbye? Rick, peace. Yes. Goodbye,
Safe
everybody.
travels, Rick. Safe travels.
Bye. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, panel people.
Take care, all.
Oh,
Thank
yeah.
you. Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Roberta.
Have
You're
a good evening.
wonderful. Bless
Good
you
evening.
all. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Tanzania. Bob.